Welcome to the War Archive, where wars become stories. At first, the war felt distant names on maps, columns, in newspapers. Then Paris shuddered beneath the thrum of engines as monoplane bombers circled overhead, dropping not just explosives, but leaflets warning the German army is at the gates. Refugees clogged boulevards, their carts jammed against abandoned automobiles. The city's heartbeat stumbled into panic. Inside a dim command office, General Joseph Gallieni, lean and bespectacled, studied reports with unwavering calm. His voice cut through the fear. "I have received the mandate to defend Paris against the invader. I shall fulfill it to the end." Outside, artillery rumbled like an approaching storm, shaking windows in their frames. Weeks earlier, Germany had lunged west under the Schlieffen Plan, racing to crush France before Russia could fully mobilize. Their armies smashed through Belgium's defenses, sidestepping France's heavily fortified east. Cavalry scouts glimpsed Parisian steeples on the horizon, their advance as swift as rumor. France, swept up in a doctrine of relentless offense, responded with Plan 17, bright uniforms, fixed bayonets, and fervor outweighing preparation. The result was brutal. At the Battle of the Frontiers, machine guns and modern artillery tore through outdated tactics. French formations dissolved beneath industrial firepower, their boldness punished by iron. The French retreated orderly, but bleeding, while the newly arrived British Expeditionary Force fought delaying actions around Mons. Each day they fell back deeper into the countryside, ceding ground to survive. Yet their withdrawal denied Germany the decisive encirclement the plan required. A timetable built on clockwork began to slip. In Paris, whispers spread through cafes and market stalls. Mothers clutched children's hands tighter. Shopkeepers stacked sandbags against doorways. The glow of the Eiffel Tower vanished each night as the city dimmed its lights, afraid to beacon death from above. Telegrams crackled with urgency. Maps sprouted pins like thorns. On the outskirts, trains screeched into stations at midnight, disgorging entire divisions. Soldiers marched through moonlit streets, boots striking cobblestones in grim percussion. Citizens watched from shuttered windows, caught between dread and pride. They offered water bread, whispered blessings, the last fragments of peace before dawn. The war that once marched across foreign valleys now pressed against Paris's ribs. And beneath a sky stained gray by distant smoke, a city braced itself not to fall, but to endure. The Great Retreat carved its way across northern France like a slow-moving storm. Day after day, French and British forces yielded ground, not in panic, but with hardened discipline trading distance for time. Rear guard skirmishes flared along dusty crossroads, quick ambushes, sudden volleys, then vanished footprints as Allied columns slipped away before German artillery could lock in. Each clash bought hours and hours, mattered more than miles. German formations advanced behind ruined logistics, following rail lines smashed by their own urgency. Supply wagons groaned along rutted roads, horses foaming at the bit, drivers snapping reins through clenched teeth. Ammunition shortages forced batteries to conserve fire, their once thunderous barrages shrinking into careful measured shots. The deeper the Germans pushed, the longer their tail stretched, and the thinner it became. Still, morale glowed hot in German ranks. They believed Paris stood within reach, the war's decisive blow, almost delivered. Officers unfolded maps atop overturned crates, tracing arcs of movement, with pencils dulled by 3 weeks of marching. Reports painted a picture of collapsing allies. Yet when scouts brushed too close to the French rear, they found not chaos but order columns marching in tight files, artillery limbering cleanly, cavalry screens snapping shut, like shutters against wind. French General Joseph Joffre, stoic and methodical, used the retreat to realign armies by rail. Troop trains hissed into hidden sidings at night, unloading brigades who moved by moonlight to fill gaps no German patrol ever saw. A Sixth Army rose near Paris, almost from thin air, quiet on the timetable, thunderous on the battlefield. Meanwhile, German high command fractured beneath distance. Headquarters sat far behind the front, its orders traveling too slow, stripped of context by the time they arrived. Armies operated like limbs without sensation, each reacting to its own horizon. Signals crackled with static. Couriers rode through artillery's reach, saddlebags flapping like wounded wings. Coordination, the spine of the Schlieffen Plan, began to bend. Paris felt the tremors. Journalists reported sightings of German cavalry just 13 kilometers from the city's edge. Bread lines grew longer, street lamps dimmed early. Yet the sight of fresh French troops marching toward the Marne steadied nerves. Citizens leaned from balconies waving tricolor ribbons, their cheers thinning the fog of dread. On the Marne's banks, the retreat paused. The river's wide sweep offered space to pivot, to turn fear into counterstroke. Officers studied the terrain beneath lantern light, marking ridges where guns could anchor bridges, where cavalry might spring forward. The air smelled of damp earth and anticipation, as though the river itself held its breath. Behind them lay valleys burned into memory. Ahead loomed ground that would decide the war's shape. The Allies had fallen back far enough. Now jaws tightened, muskets were cleaned, trenches sketched into soil. The great retreat, which had absorbed the German blow without shattering, prepared at last to return its teeth. Above the river, dawn's first light glinted off bayonets sharpening every shadow. The war that had swept across maps was about to collide with the land, and the land would decide who remained standing. Opportunity in war often appears not as triumph, but as error. For Germany, that moment came when General Alexander von Kluck, urged on by ambition, pivoted his First Army east of Paris instead of swinging wide to envelop it. The movement looked elegant on the map, an arrow tightening toward decisive victory. In reality, it pulled his flank away from safety, stretching his line like cloth thinning over a blade. Parisian air reconnaissance spotted dust trails and shifting columns, pilots scribbling sketches with numb fingers as wind tore their scarves. Soon, a leather satchel recovered from a fallen German officer confirmed the truth, marching orders marked with arrows retreating from Paris's western arc. Gallieni's spectacles glinted in lamplight as he reviewed the map. A single sentence broke his silence. "We strike where they are exposed." Around him, aides exhaled as though emerging from water. As Kluck's divisions moved south to coordinate with General Bulow's Second Army, they peeled units from their left. That thinning hinge, once reinforced by distance, became a seam. French scouts crept through orchards, surprised by how quiet the hedgerows had become. Machine gun nests lay abandoned, their barrels cool. Farther out, cavalry patrols found nothing but crushed grass and footprints leading away from Paris. Silence in war is rarely comfort, it is invitation. But Kluck saw another truth. His officers urged caution. Reconnaissance warned of massing French forces near Paris. He waved reports aside, eyes fixed on the French Fifth Army retreating before him. If he crushed their center, he believed France would collapse. His staff marked new assault points on the map. The gap at his back widened with every stroke of their pencils. General Michel Joseph Monnery's freshly formed Sixth Army surged from Paris's outskirts at dawn, bayonets catching morning light. They slammed into Kluck's exposed flank along the River Ourcq, where German reservists, gray-haired men, and half-trained boys held shallow trenches behind crumbling stone walls. Artillery roared from orchard ridges, shells bursting among apple trees that showered fruit and splinters in equal measure. The French advance staggered, but it did not break. Kluck reacted with ferocity, rushing reinforcements north in forced marches. Soldiers pivoted mid-stride boots, grinding dust into mud. Orders snapped along the line like taut wire. But every battalion sent to hold the flank tore a thread from the German front facing the British and French Fifth Army. The hinge strained, maps shifted, colors curled inward. Behind the lines, telegraph keys clattered with frantic urgency. French code officers tapped messages in clipped sequences, words riding electricity faster than cavalry could gallop, gap widening, forces realigning, strike possible. Each transmission tightened Joffre's jaw. He summoned his corps commanders with quiet resolve. The river, the ridges, the timing they aligned like tumblers in a lock. As dusk settled, lanterns bobbed through bivouacs on both sides. French officers traced assault arrows across soil-smudged maps. German adjutants redrew defensive lines, palms sweating onto parchment. The wrong turn had already been taken. Now the ground itself began to tilt around it. Men slept lightly in shallow scrapes. Fingers curled around rifle stocks slick with dew. Above them, artillery flashes pulsed like distant lightning, illuminating a truth. Neither side yet fully grasped a single decision had cracked open the front, and through that fracture the shape of the war was already beginning to change. Morning broke over rippling wheat fields and low stone farmhouses as the French Sixth Army renewed its assault along the River Ourcq. Their rifles cracked in disciplined volleys, boots pounding forward through hedgerows slick with dew. But waiting in the orchards were German machine guns and field batteries positioned with ruthless precision. The first bursts tore through advancing files, cutting branches and bodies with equal ease. Fruit thudded to the ground, rolled and split, sweet pulp mingling with dust and cordite. German reservists, outnumbered nearly 7-1, fought with grim tenacity, anchoring pockets of resistance behind barn walls blackened by shell fire. Their sergeants shouted hoarse orders, shifting squads like pieces on a board, buying seconds that mattered. Each time the French gained a courtyard or hillock, concentrated artillery fire hammered them back, turning advantage into ash. Smoke clung low across the fields, obscuring friend from foe, until muzzle flashes stitched the haze. French officers tried to seize momentum, waving flags and sabers, but modern firepower scorned heroics. Columns dissolved at the orchard line, men crawling into irrigation ditches, gasping as shrapnel hissed overhead. A battalion of elite Moroccan tirailleurs pressed farther than most, only to be scythed down, in minutes their courage swallowed by the machine age. Their losses echoed down the line, a warning carved in blood. Still, Marne refused to yield. The flank had to bend. Kluck felt the heat immediately. Reports flooded his headquarters. His left cracking his reserves, inadequate French infantry appearing where none should be. He stripped units from his right to plug the breach, forcing regiments already weary from forced marches to pivot hurriedly north. Couriers rode themselves breathless. Horses foamed and stumbled. Every reinforcement rushed to the flank hollowed another seam elsewhere. The elegant arc of advance now frayed at the edges. To the south, the British Expeditionary Force sensed opportunity in absence. Their scouts found gaps where German outposts had stood the day before. Officers exchanged glances, sharpened by instinct something was shifting. They advanced cautiously through farm lanes littered with abandoned shell crates, bayonets lowered, expecting ambush. But the hedges whispered only with wind. Silence began to feel like invitation and threat. As the day wore on, neither side fully understood the other's exhaustion. Parched French infantry drank from horse troughs, their uniforms streaked with orchard sap and soot. German gunners fought with blistered hands, barrels glowing faint red, each recoil rattling nerve and bone. Medics knelt beside craters, pressing bandages to wounds too large for cloth, whispering reassurance into ears already deafened by thunder. At sunset, the fighting slackened into sporadic bursts. The orchard floor was carpeted in crushed apples and spent casings, a sweetness soured by gunpowder. Officers walked the lines and murmured counsel, noting where trees splintered by shell fire offered crude cover. Lanterns flickered behind low stone walls as men cleaned rifles and counted cartridges, each click a reminder of tomorrow's work. Night settled like a curtain drawn over frayed nerves. The smoke thinned, revealing stars cold and uncaring above the orchard's broken canopy. Beneath them, exhausted soldiers slept in shallow scrapes, rifles cradled against their chests. Kluck's reinforcements had held for now, but every battalion diverted left pulled the hinge farther from its plan. And in the quiet between gunshots, you could almost hear it a line beginning to tear. By dawn, staff officers on both sides sensed a shift they couldn't yet see. Kluck's reinforcements flowed left like water poured into a fracture, thickening the line near the River Ourcq, but thinning everything south of it. What had been a hinge between 1st and 2nd Army began to stretch into open space. German field maps smudged by sleepless hands still showed contact where none existed. In war, a blank spot is never empty for long. British patrols crept forward through hedgerows and hollow lanes, boots sinking into damp loam. Expecting fire, they found nothing, no pickets, no wire, only churned soil and abandoned cook fires still warm. Binoculars swept empty fields fading into morning haze. A captain traced the contour of absence with a fingertip and whispered, "They've left a door open." Runners bolted back through creek beds and sunken roads, their reports thinning the fog of doubt. News reached Joffre's headquarters like the snap of a bowstring. His staff clustered around the map table, eyes widening as the gap's width expanded with each updated dispatch. The general's voice remained calm, but the orders he issued were sharp enough to cut pivot the French Fifth Army north, push the British Expeditionary Force into the opening, drive a wedge behind the German advance. Months of doctrine about decisive battles suddenly mattered again. Farther east, Bülow felt the grind of converging forces. Under pressure from Franchet-Desperat's French Fifth Army and threatened by the British, thrust, his right flank buckled. Reports arrived thick with urgency, enemy columns massing artillery-probing wire positions collapsing. Bülow considered holding, then imagined entire corps encircled by the jaws of Paris and the Marne. With a bitter swallow, he ordered withdrawal north of the river. His staff froze pens hovering above paper, knowing what a retreat would unravel. Kluck received the news hours later, too late for elegance. His army was now bent at an angle never drawn on Schlieffen's original blueprint. He stared at the map as if willing the lines to realign. But retreat pulls at pride the way gravity pulls at stone. He counterattacked south, hoping to break the French Fifth before the hinge collapsed. Each mile gained forward cost him 2 sideways. Across farm ridges and orchard lanes, Allied artillery pounded crossroads where German relief columns threaded like beads on fraying string. Shell bursts flung wagon wheels skyward, turning supply into wreckage. Medics dragged the wounded behind toppled carts while horses screamed beneath broken harness. The pressure was no longer a line, it was a tightening fist. Still, the Germans fought with practiced ferocity. Machine gun nests pivoted, sweeping advancing columns and forcing men low into drainage ditches choked with cattail and mud. Rifle volleys cracked from tree line to tree line, sparking fear where no flame burned. But the space between armies yawned wider with every regiment pulled north, every maneuver born of necessity rather than design. Allied scouts reached the high ground by late afternoon and saw it clearly, a corridor nearly 30 miles wide, nothing guarding the seam but fatigue and hope. Officers passed canteens, hands trembling not from thirst but consequence. They had trained for battles, not opportunities born from errors. Yet the battlefield rewards those who step first. As dusk bled across the Marne, lanterns bobbed along both fronts like drifting embers. French signalmen tapped coded messages that leapt across telegraph wire faster than cavalry could ever ride. British infantry angled deeper into the gap boots, brushing wheat heavy with September's last warmth. Each step tightened the noose around 2 German armies now turning inward, colliding with their own momentum. On a low rise behind the line, Gallieni's aides marked the widening seam with charcoal strokes. To them, it looked less like space and more like an opening jaw. The ground below glimmered faintly in moonlight, tall grass bowing in silent testimony. What had begun as a minor adjustment was now a fracture in an empire's ribcage. And into that fracture poured everything the Allies had left boots' breath and the quiet terror of men who sensed the world tipping beneath their feet. Night settled over Paris in nervous layers, shuttered windows, dimmed lamps, hushed cafes. In Gallieni's headquarters, reports bloomed across the map like bruises Monuri's Sixth Army was holding, but the line trembled. He needed reinforcements now. Rail traffic was choked, horse teams exhausted. Then a spark of audacity cut through the smoke of doubt. Gallieni gave an order no staff officer had ever heard requisition every taxi in Paris. Within the hour, horns echoed across boulevards as crimson liveried Renault AGs spilled from alleyways, headlights blinking like restless eyes. Drivers were pulled from late suppers and quiet corners, some still in aprons, others rubbing sleep from their beards. Soldiers clambered into back seats, rifles wedged between knees helmets scraping glass. Taximeters clicked politely habit in the face of history. Crowds lined sidewalks, their cheers rising like steam. Children waved scraps of tricolor cloth. Bakers pressed bread into soldiers' hands through open windows. Drivers gripped steering wheels tight enough to pale knuckles, engines growling beneath trembling dashboards. At Gallieni's command, the convoy rolled east, a river of headlights threading through the city's arteries. Out of Paris, the moon gilded the countryside in cold silver. Engines hammered along dirt roads flanked by whispering corn. In the distance, artillery flashes pulsed brief blossoms against the horizon, marking where night turned soldiers into silhouettes. Some drivers averted their eyes. Others stared straight into the glow, knowing they were crossing a boundary between city life and the furnace of modern war. The cabs reached the forward assembly areas before dawn. Doors slammed. Soldiers poured into orchards already scarred by shrapnel. Officers thanked the drivers with hurried nods. Clerks recorded fares on ledgers, absurd but symbolic. Gallieni understood morale was currency. If Paris paid its drivers, it hadn't surrendered its dignity. On the return trip, the roads felt heavier. Drivers met ambulances rushing the other direction, canvas sides swaying, stretcher poles jutting through flaps like broken ribs. The smell of antiseptic and burned cloth clung to the air. A driver pressed a hand to his mouth, realizing war was no rumor it breathed. At first light, Monnery unleashed his bolstered ranks. Fresh French troops surged across fields still littered with splintered apple branches and shattered tiles. German officers blinked in disbelief. Where had these men come from overnight? The line groaned under new weight. Machine gun crews snapped bolts into place, barrels spitting tracer, until the metal glowed. News of the taxis flashed across France and the world. Newspapers christened it the miracle of the Marne. Parisians toasted the drivers in cafes now lit with cautious hope. One caricature showed a taxi outracing a cavalry charge. Another depicted Gallieni tapping a meter for time bought in blood. Strategically, the taxis moved only a few thousand men, but psychologically they moved millions. They proved Paris could improvise, endure bite-back. Soldiers joked about the fare to the front. Some kept the stubs as talismans, edges browned by sweat and cordite. A lieutenant tucked his into his helmet band, murmuring, "I'll pay this when we're done." He never returned. As dusk fell again, lanterns bobbed along the French lines, illuminating new trenches and bristling rifles. German patrols listened to muffled engines rumbling behind enemy hills, unsure what machines carried such resolve. They watched the horizon flare with gunfire and felt for the first time a tremor of doubt. In the quiet hours that followed, Paris slept lightly. Its veins had pulsed reinforcements into a front that refused to break. And along the river, the orchard leaves still trembled, not from wind, but from the distant rumble of wheels that would be etched forever into memory. Above the Marne, smoke thinned to reveal a sliver of moon, silent witness to a city that had turned taxis into weapons and fear into forward motion. Dawn peeled back the darkness over the Marne to reveal a battlefield already trembling. Monnery's reinforced Sixth Army struck again along Kluck's exposed flank, their bayonets gleaming as they crossed fields scoured by yesterday's fire. The first powdery volleys rolled across the orchards, rattling branches stripped bare. German machine gun crews answered instantly, their weapons chewing through the morning haze. Yet even precision has limits when the line behind you is hollowing out. Kluck's decision to reinforce the left had carved deep ridges into the German front. Each regiment pulled northward from his right loosened the connection to Bülow's Second Army. What had been a tight hinge now sagged into open air. Staff maps still drew neat contact lines where infantry no longer stood. In headquarters, that illusion bought confidence. On the ground, it bought catastrophe. The British Expeditionary Force advanced into this vacuum with measured steps. Scouts slipped between hedgerows and shallow ravines, rifles angled low. They found fire-blackened farmhouses and scattered casings, but no rifles pointed back. When they reached a low ridge and saw only empty fields where gray uniforms should have been, an officer felt his stomach drop. He whispered to his adjutant, "God help them, they've overreached." Then he ordered his battalion's forward boots, thudding across dew-dark grass. Southward, the French Fifth Army pivoted, hammering Bülow's strained flank. Artillery teams unlimbered on ridges, their guns coughing thunder into crossroads where German supply wagons jammed. Horses buckled, drivers scrambled beneath splintering wheels. In the confusion, stretcher-bearers carried the wounded through clouds of dust that smelled of burned linen and cordite. The line groaned, then bent. Kluck counterattacked, fiercely determined to crack the French Fifth before the noose tightened. His infantry surged forward in disciplined waves, helmets glinting like hammered bronze. They gained ground yards at a time until fresh French batteries roared from newly occupied high ground. Shells rained down, tearing trenches into ragged mouths. Forward momentum evaporated. Men flattened themselves into earth still warm from summer's sun. Behind the front telegraph wires hummed with frantic messages. Operators worked their keys as if staving off panic by rhythm alone. Reports of widening gaps, collapsing junctions, and British columns threading deeper into open space clattered across the network. Joffre read them in silence, a finger tapping where two neat German arrows diverged. With a single breath, he ordered every available corps into the seam. The Germans felt the shift like pressure in the chest. Their neat arc, once an elegant crescent cutting toward Paris, had kinked into an awkward angle. Columns marching north collided with columns retreating south, entire regiments forced to halt on narrow roads. Couriers galloped into dust clouds so thick they tasted grit on their tongues. Officers argued over priority, their voices frayed by fatigue. In the margins of war, friction becomes weapon. At sunset, the battlefield quieted to sporadic exchanges of rifle fire. French soldiers exhaled steam into the cooling air, staring across fields littered with apple branches and tattered knapsacks. German infantry crouched behind hastily stacked stones, shoulders, trembling eyes dark from sleepless nights. Both sides understood they were no longer fighting for miles, but for structure itself. Night fell thick and moonless. Lanterns bobbed through trenches like captive stars, casting long shadows against earthen walls. The hinge between two German armies, once taut with intention, had torn into open corridor, and in the quiet between artillery bursts, officers on both sides finally recognized what the terrain already knew. When a hinge snaps, the door does not simply sag. It swings wide. Far behind the front, in a quiet Luxembourg villa, turned headquarters. Chief of Staff, Helmuth von Moltke, paced like a man trapped inside his own blueprint. Maps hung on every wall, arrows swooping toward Paris, timetables stamped in precise handwriting. But couriers arrived breathless, their reports contradicting each other. Units went missing between ink and earth. The elegant curve of the offensive had kinked into chaos, and Moltke's hands trembled. He had already thinned the western wing to reinforce East Prussia, weakening the very stroke the plan depended on. Now with Kluck veering inward and Bülow bending backward, the German line resembled a hinge worked past tolerance. Staff officers watched Moltke's voice crack mid-briefing. He muttered about blood accountability history's judgment. The plan's architect was dissolving beneath the weight of his own calculations. Unable to command from distance, Moltke dispatched Colonel Richard Hench, a liaison officer. With unusual authority, he could speak in Moltke's name. Hench rode between field headquarters across roads thick with dust, past ambulances swaying like wounded animals. When he reached Bülow, he found the general pale pointing at the widening gap on his map. Shellfire shook the shutters. Hench listened, frowned, then agreed withdrawal north of the Marne was necessary. Pence scratched orders into history. Hours later, Hench confronted Kluck, whose troops had gained ground against the French Fifth Army. Kluck slammed his fist against the map table. Victory, he insisted, was inches away, but the gap behind him yawned open, threatening to swallow two entire armies. Hench invoked Moltke's authority with a voice that betrayed fatigue. The order stood retreat. Kluck stared at the parchment as if it were a verdict. On the front line, German columns began to pivot north. Engineers detonated bridges, stone arches collapsing into churning water. Supply wagons burst into flame, their explosions rolling across villages like drums of retreat. Soldiers waded rivers, waist-deep rifles held above heads, water dragging at their coats. Officers barked orders muffled by smoke and falling masonry. The withdrawal was controlled, but barely. Allied artillery seized the moment. French batteries pounded crossings, shells whistling into wagon jams and turning crossroads into maelstroms of splintered wood and steel. British riflemen picked targets from hedgerows, their volleys steady as metronomes. Medics dragged limp bodies behind farm walls, bandaging wounds that oozed through cotton faster than cloth could absorb. In Luxembourg, Moltke received word that Bülow and Kluck were pulling back. The room blurred. Witnesses later recalled his face draining of color. He whispered that he had lost control of the battle, then closed his office door. Aides heard muffled sobs. Hours later, he wired Berlin a message heavy enough to tilt the war's axis. The situation is extremely serious. The telegram's ripples reached the capital like cold water. Ministers whispered about uncertainty. Newspapers printed cautious headlines. The 42-day promise, the swift knockout, it was gone. Germany now faced a war of duration, not maneuver. But along the Marne retreat did not mean collapse. German regiments held rearguard positions with iron discipline slowing Allied pursuit with interlocking fields of fire. Officers sacrificed companies to save battalions. Every burned wagon, every toppled bridge bought minutes measured in blood. By dusk, the German line had curved north in ragged order bayonets bristling along shallow ridges. Exhausted soldiers dug shallow scrapes with helmet edges pressing their weight into the earth as if hoping to merge with it. The final bridges detonated behind them in fountains of orange sparks. Night descended thick and breathless. Fires crackled along the riverbanks, casting shadows that twitched like restless ghosts. In the flicker, men stared across the dark water, hearing distant cheers from Allied platoons reclaiming empty ground. The sound sharpened a wound deeper than any bullet. The German dream of Paris, the swift war, the elegant plan vanished into smoke curling above black water. What remained was heavier, slower, and far more terrifying, the realization that the war was no longer about movement. It was about what could endure in the dark. The retreat from the Marne unfolded like a long exhale, measured, reluctant, and edged with pain. German columns withdrew in disciplined files, boots thumping against mud churned by artillery wheels. Engineers destroyed bridges behind them, stone arches collapsing into frothing water. The explosions echoed across valleys, each detonation a sharp punctuation mark, in a sentence the army no longer wished to read. Allied guns hounded them from the high ground. French batteries lofted shells into crossroads, ripping supply wagons sideways in clouds of splintered wood. British riflemen fired from hedgerows, their volleys crisp and unhurried. Medics dragged the wounded behind toppled carts, hands slick with antiseptic and gore. Yet despite the pressure, German infantry refused to break. Officers kept order with clipped commands, their voices carved by exhaustion. Logistics buckled beneath the strain. Horses collapsed in their traces, flanks heaving. Drivers stroked their muzzles before ending their suffering with a single round. Bread hardened to brick, water tasted of rusted canteens. Soldiers chewed in silence, jaws stiff with fatigue. Rain turned roads into brown rivers. Men learned to sleep standing, leaning against rifles like exhausted sentries guarding themselves. As the German line bent north, it found spine on the ridges above the River Aisne. Officers traced firing arcs into the churned earth and ordered the shovels out. Soldiers dug it first with helmets, then with blistered hands until deeper trenches took shape. Machine gun nests sprouted behind sandbags stacked like angled teeth. Artillery crouched behind the ridge barrels trained across valleys where French columns gathered. The Allies attacked anyway. French infantry advanced in tight formations up the slope bayonets, shining like a promise. German machine guns opened from concealed emplacements, cutting the assault into ragged pieces. Mortar bombs tumbled into ravines with sickening thuds. Bodies slid down wet grass boots, leaving streaks in the hillside. A few platoons gained footing at the crest, only to be swept aside by counterattacks wielding bayonet and grenade. Meanwhile, British troops probed the flanks, searching for a seam that no longer existed. Everywhere they turned fresh digging. Trenches zigzagged through vineyards and orchards. Timber planking laid to keep boots above water. Wire entanglements hummed in the wind. Officers blinked at the transformation. Germany had not simply retreated, it had rooted. For days, the Allied assault hammered the ridge. Artillery barrages shuddered through the soil, flinging dirt and rock into the trenches. German soldiers absorbed the impacts in dugouts, reinforced with doors ripped from farmhouses. Their ears rang, their chests ached from concussive waves. Still they rose when the bombardment lifted rifles steady. By late September, the battle pattern blurred bombardment, assault. Counterfire silence. The ridge held. Couriers rode along trench lines, delivering orders slicked with rain. Telegraph keys chattered with clipped updates, each message more resigned. Officers realized the truth pushing farther risked bleeding the army white for scrapings of ground. The attack slowed into wary observation. Then came the moment of grim recognition. The front had stopped moving. Men carved deeper shelters against autumn's chill. They stacked sandbags higher, reinforcing parapets. Drainage channels burrowed beneath firing steps. Field kitchens steamed behind earthen walls. Soldiers pinned talismans and photographs into timber supports, making homes from holes in the earth. Across the valley, lanterns bobbed like faint floating stars. French patrols listened for German whispers. German sentries heard coughs drifting from the Allied side. In the eerie stillness, voices sometimes carried songs muffled by distant fragments of prayer swallowed by wind. When the moon rose over the ridge, it revealed something uncanny. Two armies facing each other, not by maneuver, but by habit locked into ground that would not yield. The speed of August had become the stalemate of September. Among the trenches, a private pressed his palm to the damp wall. The earth felt cold, unmoved by victory, indifferent to loss. For the first time he understood that the war had changed shape. Not broken, not ended, only sunk deeper. Autumn rain swept across the Aisne, running in thin rivulets down the chalky slopes where German trenches took shape. What began as shallow scrapes deepened into fortified corridors, zigzagged to confound shrapnel reinforced with timber ripped from barns. Men worked through the night shovels, clinking like muted bells. When dawn lit the valley, the German line no longer looked like an army in retreat, but a rooted wall of earth and wire. The French attacked again, driven by doctrine that still worshipped the offensive. Bayonets flashed as companies climbed the ridge in tight formation, voices swallowed by machine gun reports. Modern firepower punished bravery with impersonal efficiency. Mortars dropped shells into gullies where men crouched shoulder to shoulder, turning living cover into crimson spray. Officers waved their troops forward, then ducked as shrapnel plowed furrows in the hillside. Down in the German trenches, soldiers hugged firing steps slick with rain. Riflemen fired through narrow slits, their muzzles coughing flame into the mist. Machine gunners cooled overheated barrels with wet cloths wrung from canteens. Artillery spotters scribbled coordinates on scraps of muddy parchment, relaying them through telephones that crackled like insects. The line bent beneath the assault, but did not break. As casualties mounted, disbelief rippled through French ranks. Every charge left more bodies tangled in wire, their uniforms soaked dark. Officers conferred behind shattered stone walls, staring at ridgelines that refused to yield. They adjusted timetables, angled attacks, and called fresh bombardments. None cracked the earthwork maze now pulsing with German resolve. Pride and doctrine gave way to grim recalculation. Meanwhile, the British probed the flanks, searching for the mobility the battlefield had lost. They found trenches sprouting everywhere, communication ditches branching like Roots reserve bunkers tucked into the hillside. Artillery duels rumbled from dawn to dusk, shells converging on crossroads and ravines. Smoke hung low, burning lungs and turning silhouettes into phantoms. The ground seemed to absorb war rather than repel it. Days blurred into rhythm, dig, fire, endure. Soldiers learned to recognize artillery by sound alone, the shriek of incoming, the hollow thump of impact. Boots stayed perpetually damp. Letters arrived, smudged ink bleeding where rain had crept beneath seals. Men pinned photographs inside dugouts, candlelight trembling over familiar faces. Rats grew fat on crumbs, and corpses' eyes glinting like beads in lantern glow. A pattern settled over the valley. Each Allied offensive jolted the German line only for counterfire to press it flat again. Trenches sank deeper, duckboards slatted into mud. The ridge no longer belonged to armies, it belonged to the shovel. Dead ground multiplied each crater, widening no man's land into a geography of hesitation. Officers exchanged glances, sharpened by fatigue. This ground would not be traded cheaply. By month's end, both sides halted assaults not from mercy, but depletion. The ridge smoldered beneath a quiet sky strewn with broken rifles and apple branches splintered by shell fire. Patrols crouched, low ears pricked for the scrape of wire cutters. Lanterns bobbed behind parapets like cautious fireflies casting long shadows that stretched across trenches carved deeper into the skin of France. In that hush, men finally saw what they had built. Not positions, not advantage, but walls between themselves and the world they remembered. A young private rested his forehead against cold sandbags, listening to water drip in the dark. The sound was steady, relentless, like the war itself. Above the valley, stars flickered through thinning smoke. Their light revealed trenches twisting toward horizons neither army could see past. Movement had given way to waiting. The war's front had not stalled simply in space. It had stalled in time. What followed was not silence, but settling. Along the Aisne, both armies realized their plans had collided with the landscape itself. Trenches lengthened overnight, curling along ridgelines and riverbanks like roots seeking purchase. Engineers laid timber supports, stacked sandbags into parapets, and drove stakes for barbed wire that hummed softly in the wind. The battlefield, once fluid and wild, thickened into geometry angles of fire arcs, of observation fields of death measured in meters. French commanders, still shaped by pre-war doctrine, ordered renewed assaults. At dawn, whistles shrilled and waves of infantry broke from cover. Their advance cracked against machine gun fire hidden behind earthen lips. Shrapnel tore through ranks, boots sliding on wet clay as officers urged them up the slope. A few reached the German parapet, only to find bayonets waiting in tight, practiced jabs. Momentum drained into the mud, replaced by grim arithmetic. The British probed the flanks, seeking space to maneuver, but found only fresh trenches dug overnight. Wherever they shifted, Germans mirrored them. Trenches twisted toward the Channel, and the Swiss frontier, each side racing north to outflank the other. But every attempt ended the same way: new wire, new ditches, new lines. Maps lost color as staff officers inked new labyrinths across the countryside. The race to the sea became the birth of a cage. On the front lines, life contorted into routine. Men slept in dugouts carved from clay walls, sweating moisture into their blankets. Trench boards creaked under constant rain. Cooks ladled thin stew from steaming cauldrons, the smell drifting through narrow corridors of earth. Rats feasted on scraps and on bodies not yet retrieved. Their eyes glinted in lantern light, indifferent to uniform. Soldiers killed them with trench knives and tossed them aside, only for others to scurry forward. Morale oscillated with rumor. Whispers spread of gas shells, armored shields, monstrous artillery. Letters from home became talismans, ink-smudged corners softened by hands that needed to remember tenderness. Priests moved through the trenches, offering rites in quiet nooks where the walls seemed to lean in and listen. Sometimes at night, a harmonica drifted across no man's land. German sentries replied with a violin's thin, aching note. For a moment, the war breathed like memory. Higher up the chain, strategies hardened. Staff colleges had never taught how to break an army buried 3 meters deep. Artillery barrages flattened ground but rarely cracked parapets. Infantry attacks dissolved into smoke and wire. Generals spoke of attrition, of wearing the enemy down, until something inside snapped. Newspapers printed victory rhetoric, but soldiers felt the truth in their bones: the war had buried its teeth into the soil. Industry answered the generals' new ambitions. Factories roared to life, forging shells faster than they could be fired. Women stepped into workshops, sleeves rolled past elbows, sparks dancing at their feet. Coal trains screamed through mountain passes. Economists muttered about steel quotas. The war had outgrown the men who fought it. Now nations themselves marched to the front. One evening, rain softened into mist. French patrols slipped through tall grass ears tuned to the metallic tink of German wire posts being hammered into place. They withdrew silently, knowing tomorrow's assault would meet new teeth. In dugouts, young soldiers stared at ration tins stamped with factory insignia. They had imagined glory. Now they imagined warmth. By October's first frost, the lines had anchored into permanence. Officers walked parapets with clipped warnings: keep heads low, watch the wire, trust the shovel. The shovel proved the most important weapon of the month. Its edge carved shelter from artillery, built platforms for machine guns, and buried comrades before sunrise. At dusk, a British lieutenant leaned on the lip of his trench, peering across the silent valley. Lanterns glimmered along the German line close enough to touch with imagination. He exhaled breath ghosting into the cold air and whispered to no one, "We are not moving again soon." Beyond the wire, night thickened. Dew collected on twisted barbs, each droplet catching starlight like a jewel on the teeth of something waiting. The Marne had saved Paris, but it had chained Europe to the earth. In the dark, the trenches breathed, and the war exhaled into stillness, settling deeper into the soil it would refuse to leave. By mid-autumn, the Western Front resembled a wound scabbed over in steel and clay. Both armies, having lunged and counter-lunged across the Marne, now sank into positions carved by necessity. Command posts huddled in farm cellars. Observation balloons hovered like tethered ghosts above the mist. Staff officers studied maps whose inked lines no longer suggested motion, only depth. The war had entered a phase the textbooks never taught. French doctrine still clung to the offensive. The order of the day remained attack, columns loaded grenades and fixed bayonets, then surged uphill through sleet and smoke. Machine guns shredded momentum in seconds, snapping men backward as if pulled by invisible rope. Artillery scoured the slopes, wreathing the battlefield in gray haze that made orientation a luxury. Officers tried to rally with whistles and sabers, but modern warfare had no patience for silhouettes. German defensive doctrine hardened by the hour. Engineers reinforced sapheads forward nibs of trench meant to listen probe and pressure. Mortars plopped shells into ravines where French squads crawled for shelter. When Allied artillery ceased, German infantry leapt onto fire steps and poured volleys downhill. Their rifles cracked with mechanical rhythm, each shot stitched into the tapestry of attrition. Between assaults, patrols crawled through no-man's-land mud, clinging to elbows and chin straps. They clipped enemy wire ghosted trenches and listened for whispers through the dark. A single cough could betray a platoon. Sometimes a startled bird took flight. Rifles snapped up instinctively, firing into blackness that swallowed bullets without sound. The night itself felt predatory. Inside dugouts, trench life acquired shape. Water pooled ankle-deep. Duckboards floated like tired boats beneath boot soles. Letters from home arrived smelling faintly of lavender or coal smoke, their corners softened by the rain. Cigarettes passed between fingers shared like communion. Lice thrived along collars. Trench fever spread with the stealth of rumored joints, aching eyes fever-bright beneath mud. High command demanded breakthroughs. Reality offered stalemate. Staff briefings read like prayers. Heavy artillery preparation, rolling barrages, creeping advances measured in meters. Economics intruded. Shell shortages dictated battle rhythm. Coal trains became lifelines. Governments requisitioned factories, turning sewing floors into shell press lines and carriage shops into artillery forges. Women stepped behind lathes, hair tied back beneath kerchiefs, sparks snapping at their sleeves. New weapons whispered from the edges of doctrine. Rifle grenades, trench mortars, shields bolted to stocks, experiments scribbled into muddy margins. Commanders spoke of combined arms as if invoking a charm. But each innovation seemed to lengthen the trench lines rather than crack them. The battlefield swallowed ideas whole, digesting them into deeper frustration. The race to the sea continued, armies pivoting northward, seeking open land to outflank their mirrored rival. Towns changed hands only to dissolve beneath artillery that leveled church spires and schoolhouses alike. When cavalry found open country, it rarely stayed open for long. By dawn, trenches spread like ivy along the fields, binding maneuver into immobility. On a cold evening, mist pooled across no man's land. A lone harmonica drifted from the French side, soft wandering notes. A violin answered from German trenches, thin, earnest trembling. For a moment, men on both sides lowered their chins, the music threading through helmets and wire. Then the last note faded, leaving a silence more suffocating than gunfire. In headquarters far behind the ridge, officers added new phrases to their vocabulary: attrition, industrial capacity, national endurance. The war had shed its romantic illusions. It now demanded economies, minerals factory shifts, and bodies. No timetable could tame it. At dawn, a French sergeant peered over the parapet. Dew jeweled the barbed wire in front of him, each droplet catching sunrise like sparks frozen mid-flight. He exhaled slowly, frost blooming in the air. The line did not move, but every day it consumed. While the trenches bit deep into France, the Eastern Front heaved with movement and shock. In East Prussia, German commanders leveraged railroads like arteries pulsing fresh divisions into threatened sectors. The result was a brutal symphony of encirclement. At Tannenberg, Russian units found themselves cut off by precise maneuvers. Entire columns vanished into forests littered with abandoned guns and shattered wagons. Prisoners marched west in endless files, silent frost-breathed silhouettes swallowed by the pines. Barely weeks later, the Masurian Lakes campaign delivered another hammer blow. Shells burst across wetlands, showering reeds and icy spray. Russian infantry retreated through boggy ground rifles, held high boots sucking into mud that refused to release its grip. Only the astonishing pace of their withdrawal, 40 kilometers a day, prevented total annihilation. Officers burned maps to deny intel flames wavering in wind, howling across lake ice. Yet Russia struck back against Austria-Hungary with devastating force. In Galicia, sprawling battles chewed through regiments on both sides. Artillery turned wheat fields into scarred craters. Austrian command fractured its logistics, snarled by distance, and shattered rail lines. Casualties mounted into six figures. Entire corps fell back toward the Carpathians' uniforms, caked with clay and defeat. News raced through Vienna, a whisper swelling into dread. Politicians logged casualty lists that stretched across tables. Telegrams arrived in curt, unfeeling script: lost, missing, wounded, unrecoverable. In small towns, church bells tolled until ropes frayed. Mothers clutched letters smudged by their tears. The Eastern War lacked the symmetry of trenches. Instead, it sprawled like wildfire, fanned by rail timetables and desperate gambles. It was movement at knife point. Still, the victories in Prussia steadied German fears. Panic over endless Russian hordes receded. Newspapers celebrated commanders as saviors of the fatherland. But on the southern flank, Austria-Hungary staggered its pride, battered its lines, crumpling under Russian pressure. Chief of Staff Konrad von Hötzendorf, an architect of early aggression, now muttered regrets behind closed doors. His subordinates whispered that if Archduke Franz Ferdinand were alive, Konrad would face a court-martial or worse. Diplomats sensed shifting gravity. In London, Paris, and Petrograd negotiations crystallized into the Pact of London, no separate peace. If this war was to be survived, it would be survived together. Cabinets signed with hands that trembled, not from fear, but from recognition. The conflict was not months long. It was epical. Back on the Western Front, officers read dispatches by candlelight. Russian losses, Austrian collapse, German panic eased, French exhaustion deepened. The war's geometry expanded now, a continent's lungs heaved with every maneuver. In muddy trenches, corporals traded rumors as readily as cigarettes. They imagined eastern cities falling like dominoes, though few could pronounce their names. Artillery flashes in France echoed the chaos of Galicia. Soldiers felt consequences not just in their own valleys, but on fronts hundreds of miles away. The battlefield had become an organism, and nerves ran across borders. Pressure in Poland meant relief on the Marne. A breakthrough near Lemberg tugged at timetables in Champagne. Strategy was now continental. One night, a German sergeant unfolded a newspaper clipping mailed from home. It bore a headline celebrating the Masurian victory. Lantern glow flickered across his tired face. "Good," he muttered. "We need something." His companion nodded and stared into darkness, imagining vast forests he'd never see, where men like him bled into snow. Distant thunder rolled along the ridges of the Western Front, not weather artillery. Above the parapet, barbed wire glistened with dew, each droplet reflecting tiny hints of firelight. On one side, trenches sank deeper. On the other, armies still moved like storms. Together they sharpened a truth no one yet dared speak: the West had frozen, but the East still turned the blade. The failure at the Marne rippled outward like a stone dropped into deep water. What had been conceived as a swift, crushing war the Schlieffen Plan's elegant sweep around Paris collapsed into a retreat hardened by trenches. On ridges above the Aisne, German infantry dug deeper, the spade becoming as vital as the rifle. Earth absorbed the shock of artillery. Parapets of sandbags turned bullets aside. The front line stopped moving, and with it, something inside every soldier shifted. Allied armies hurled themselves against these new defenses. French infantry surged up slopes under the weight of doctrine, their officers still preaching that audacity could conquer geometry. Machine guns answered that belief coldly. British battalions probed north and south, hoping to slip around the ridge only to find trenches sprouting like weeds overnight. The race to the sea ended not in breakthrough, but in walls, a continuous scar of wire and earth curling from the Channel to Switzerland. Behind the lines, molars ground through sleepless nights. Generals traded the language of maneuver for attrition. Factories rumbled to life, forging shells in endless rhythms. Clouds of smoke darkening the sky, even in cities far from the front. Coal trains screamed across bridges. Steelworks glowed like volcanic throats. The war no longer belonged to cavalry charges or clever flanking arcs. It belonged to industry, to hunger, to time. Governments felt the clamp tighten. Budgets evaporated. Ration cards multiplied. Censorship hardened into habit. The Pact of London, a vow of no separate peace, bound France, Britain, and Russia into a marriage defined not by trust, but by fear of standing alone. Cabinets whispered of manpower curves of food, tonnage of winter coal. Diplomats traded smiles like knives. In the trenches, the world shrank to meters. Men learned the difference between incoming and outgoing shells by sound alone. Rats feasted on biscuit crumbs, and the dead without discrimination. Lice burrowed into collars. Letters from home became lifelines, creased pages scented faintly with soap or hearth smoke. Between barrages, soldiers stared at photographs pinned into timber supports, candle stubs trembling beside faces waiting in another life. Across no man's land, lanterns winked along both parapets at night. Patrols crawled through grass slick with dew ears tuned to wire singing in the wind. Once, a French harmonica wandered into the dark. A German violin answered with a fragile tremor. That brief thread of melody hovered where artillery had just plowed furrows, then thinned into silence too cold to hold. Far away in hospital wards, nurses washed blood from stretchers until their wrists numbed. Doctors stared at new wounds their textbooks had never described. Families queued before notice boards, breath-fogging glass as they searched for names. Factory girls walked home beneath smoke-blackened skies, lanterns swinging like tired stars. By winter's first frost, the front had frozen literally and figuratively. Officers surveyed mud walls that now bore the weight of the entire continent's anxiety. No timetable promised relief. No maneuver offered escape. Soldiers spoke in whispers about spring, though none knew what spring meant anymore. One cold dawn, a corporal rested his chin on folded arms atop a sandbag parapet. In the gray light, the barbed wire glistened, each droplet catching sunrise like beads threaded along a crown of thorns. Beyond it, the German line shimmered faintly, silent, watchful. The corporal exhaled. His breath drifted like smoke into the frozen air. He could not see Paris or Berlin or Galicia, but he felt all their weight pressing through the soil beneath his boots. What the Marne had prevented was decisive victory. What it delivered was something heavier permanence. The war that should have ended in weeks now stretched a shadow across seasons, swallowing millions, one shell, one ration, one trench at a time. And as the sun climbed over barbed wire glinting on frost and steel alike, Europe settled into a posture it would not escape for 4 long years, bent unblinking teeth clenched against the dark.